This was one of the craziest off seasons we've ever had in college football history. We saw more coaching changes than ever before. We also saw players transfer at a higher rate than we've ever seen. There were thousands of players who entered the transfer portal during the offseason, so it was very tough to keep track of where players ended up. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the top quarterbacks who were in the portal and where they transferred to, because if you were off the grid for just one day, you likely missed a few. Before we get to today's video, make sure to smash that subscribe button and turn on those notifications if you're new to my channel. If you love college football, then this is definitely the place for you. Also, make sure to drop a like on this video as well. It helps share the video with more college football fans, plus it only takes a second to do. For today's video, I'm not going to be going too in-depth on each player, as there's about 30 names that we need to get to. Plus, I've touched up on all these names during the offseason at one point already. I'll just be giving a quick recap for each player. We'll start with probably the biggest name on the list, someone I've probably spent about 5 videos talking about this offseason, Caleb Williams. He transferred from Oklahoma to USC. He'll be replacing Kedon Slovis and Jackson Dart, two names that we'll get to later in this video. Last season for Oklahoma, Williams threw for just under 2,000 yards with 21 passing touchdowns and 4 interceptions. He also added nearly 500 yards on the ground with 6 rushing touchdowns. Up next is Spencer Rattler, who Caleb Williams replaced at Oklahoma. Rattler will be transferring from Oklahoma to South Carolina. Luke Doughty and Jason Brown split time at the quarterback position last year for the Gamecocks, along with Zeb Noland. As a team, South Carolina combined to throw only 22 touchdowns with 10 interceptions. In his limited action last season, Rattler threw for 1,500 yards while completing 75% of his passes. He also threw 11 touchdowns with 5 interceptions while rushing for 3 touchdowns. Up next is a quarterback we haven't really seen anything of yet in Quinn Ewers. He transferred from Ohio State to Texas. He'll be taking over for Casey Thompson. Ewers only played a few snaps while at Ohio State, but he ends up at Texas, where he likely would have originally ended up. Ewers is one of the most highly touted quarterback recruits of all time, so it's going to be interesting to see if he's able to live up to the hype. Earlier, we mentioned Caleb Williams transferring to USC, meaning a few quarterbacks had to transfer out. We'll start off with Jackson Dart, who's going to be transferring to Ole Miss, taking over for Matt Corral. While splitting reps at the quarterback spot last year, Dart threw for 1,400 yards with 9 passing touchdowns and 5 interceptions. The other USC quarterback that entered the portal was Kedon Slovis, who transferred to Pittsburgh. He'll be replacing Kenny Pickett. While splitting time with Dart, Slovis threw for over 2,100 yards with 11 passing touchdowns and 8 interceptions. During his 3 seasons at USC, he threw for over 7,500 yards while completing nearly 69% of his passes for 58 total touchdowns. We kicked off this list with Caleb Williams and Spencer Rattler leaving Oklahoma. Well, Dylan Gabriel comes in to replace them. He originally transferred to UCLA after leaving UCF, but upon Caleb Williams entering the portal, Gabriel decided to transfer to Oklahoma. He appeared in only 3 games last season for the Knights, throwing for 800 yards with 9 touchdowns. In his 3 seasons at UCF, Gabriel threw for over 8,000 yards with 70 passing touchdowns. After a lengthy career and setting numerous records at Nebraska, Adrian Martinez transferred to Kansas State. He'll be replacing Skylar Thompson. In his 4th season with the Cornhuskers, Martinez threw for nearly 3,000 yards with 14 passing touchdowns. He also added over 500 yards on the ground with 13 rushing touchdowns. In his 4 seasons with Nebraska, Martinez threw for 8,500 yards with 45 passing touchdowns. On the ground, he rushed for 2,300 yards with 35 rushing touchdowns. Coming over to Nebraska was former Texas quarterback Casey Thompson. In 12 games for Texas last season, he threw for over 2,100 yards with 24 passing touchdowns and 9 interceptions. 2021 was his first season as the starting quarterback for the Longhorns, as he backed up Sam Ehlinger for a number of years. Entering 2021, he had only made 29 pass attempts in his career. Up next is Michael Penix Jr., who transferred from Indiana to Washington. Last season, Dylan Morris was the starting quarterback for the Huskies. He's still there, so he's going to be competing with Penix Jr. for the starting job. Penix Jr. spent 4 seasons at Indiana, but dealt with a number of season-ending injuries. He appeared in only 5 games last season for the Hoosiers, completing only 54% of his passes. He threw for under 1,000 yards with 4 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. In his 4 seasons at Indiana, he threw for 4,200 yards with 29 passing touchdowns and 15 interceptions. Taking the spot of Penix Jr. at Indiana will be Connor Bazelak, who transfers over from Missouri. Over the last 2 seasons for the Tigers, he's thrown for 5,000 yards with 23 passing touchdowns. After a solid 2020 campaign, he was named the SEC's Co-Freshman of the Year. One of the top FCS quarterbacks who was in the portal was Cameron Ward, who transferred to Washington State from Incarnate Ward. He'll be taking the spot of Jayden de Laura, who we'll get to next. In the spring of 2021, Ward won the Jerry Rice Award given to the most outstanding freshman in FCS football. Then, in the fall of 2021, he was named the Southland Conference Offensive Player of the Year and was a Walter Payton Award finalist. In the fall, he threw for 4,700 yards with 47 passing touchdowns. Speaking of Jayden de Laura, he transferred from Washington State to Arizona. The Wildcats had 4 different players throw a touchdown in 2021. De Laura appeared in 16 games over the last 2 seasons for the Cougars. He threw for 3,700 yards with 28 passing touchdowns. He also added 5 touchdowns on the ground as well. In 2021, De Laura led the Pac-12 in passing yards and passing touchdowns during conference play. Up next is a player who has a strong familiarity with the transfer portal. After being benched for Stetson Bennett, JT Daniels decided to transfer from Georgia to West Virginia. He'll be replacing Jarrett Doege, who is the Mountaineers' starting quarterback. Daniels started the season as Georgia's starter last year, but a few injuries led him to become the second string behind Bennett. Daniels completed 72% of his passes for 700 yards and 7 touchdowns. In his 4 years of playing, Daniels has thrown for just under 5,000 yards with 32 passing touchdowns and 16 interceptions. Speaking of Jarrett Doege, he transferred from West Virginia to Western Kentucky. He'll be taking over for Bailey Zappi, who just posted a record-breaking season in 2021. Doege has a chance to finish his career with a bang. After starting at Bowling Green, he's thrown 1,500 passes in his career. This will be his 6th collegiate season. So far, he's thrown for 10,500 yards and has 79 career passing touchdowns. If he's able to play a full season, he has a chance to finish his college football career in the top 10 to 20 in a lot of offensive categories. We'll move over to Jayden Daniels, who transferred from Arizona State to LSU. He'll be taking over for Max Johnson, who also transferred. Daniels was the starter for the Sun Devils for 3 seasons. In his career, he's thrown for over 6,000 yards with 32 passing touchdowns and 13 interceptions. He's also rushed for 1,300 yards with 13 rushing touchdowns. Before Daniels transferred in, Max Johnson transferred out, as he transferred to Texas A&M. He'll be replacing Zach Calzada. Max Johnson started 12 games for the Tigers last season, throwing for 2,800 yards with 27 passing touchdowns and 6 interceptions. He appeared in only 6 games in 2020, but he threw for over 1,000 yards with 8 touchdowns and only 1 interception. Speaking of Zach Calzada, he transferred from Texas A&M to Auburn, where he'll be replacing Bo Nix. In 12 games last season, Calzada threw for 2,200 yards with 17 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. In his 2 prior seasons with the Aggies, he attempted only 24 passes. With a new quarterback in there, that means Bo Nix's time at Auburn has come to an unfortunate end. The legend himself transferred to Oregon, where he'll be replacing Anthony Brown. During his 3 seasons with the Tigers, Bo Nix threw for 7,200 yards with 39 passing touchdowns and 16 interceptions. He's also rushed for nearly 900 yards on the ground with 18 rushing touchdowns. This next one is a quick fun one, as Fresno State quarterback Jake Haener was originally in the transfer portal, and I think he actually was planning on committing to Washington, but he decommitted and ended up back at Fresno State. Earlier we talked about Arizona State quarterback Jayden Daniels transferring, so it means they had an opening. Florida quarterback Emory Jones transferred in. He appeared in 13 games for the Gators in 2021, throwing for 2,700 yards with 19 passing touchdowns and 13 interceptions. He rushed for 800 yards and had 4 touchdowns on the ground, while also adding a receiving touchdown. During his time in Florida, he threw for just under 3,500 yards with 26 passing touchdowns, while adding 1,300 yards on the ground with 10 rushing touchdowns. Earlier, I mentioned that Dylan Gabriel left UCF. Well, filling his role will be Ole Miss quarterback John Reese Plumlee. After originally playing quarterback for Ole Miss, he transitioned into a wide receiver running back role with Matt Corral there. He'll be a quarterback again for the Knights though. During his time at Ole Miss, Plumlee threw for 1,000 yards with 5 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. On the ground, he rushed for 1,200 yards and 12 rushing touchdowns. Most of those numbers though came back in 2019. He also added 25 receptions for 300 yards. Up next is Grant Wells, who transferred from Marshall to Virginia Tech, where he'll replace Braxton Burmeister. After a solid start to his career, Wells just hasn't been the same quarterback. He did throw for over 3,500 yards last season, but he threw only 16 touchdown passes. In his 2 seasons as the starting quarterback for the Herd, he threw for 5,600 yards with 34 passing touchdowns and 22 interceptions. Speaking of Braxton Burmeister, he'll be transferring from Virginia Tech to San Diego State. Last season was Burmeister's first full season as a starter after 2 years at Oregon and a COVID-shortened season at Virginia Tech. He threw for 2,000 yards with 14 passing touchdowns, while also adding 500 yards on the ground with 2 rushing touchdowns. One of the best quarterbacks in Hawaii history transferred, as Chevan Cordeiro transferred to San Jose State, staying in conference. He'll take over for longtime college football quarterback Nick Starkel. In 2021, Cordeiro threw for 2,800 yards with 17 passing touchdowns. Over his career with the Rainbow Warriors, he's thrown for 6,200 yards with 45 passing touchdowns, while also rushing for over 1,000 yards with 13 rushing touchdowns. We'll wrap up this video with Gary Bohannon, who transferred from Baylor to South Florida. This past season for Baylor, he threw for 2,200 yards with 18 passing touchdowns and 7 interceptions. He also rushed for 9 touchdowns on the ground with 300 yards rushing. Last year was his first shot as the starting quarterback after being at Baylor since 2019. Well, those were all the notable quarterbacks I was able to keep track of that transferred this offseason. Which quarterback on this list do you think is going to make the biggest impact at their new program? Was there somehow a quarterback on this list that I didn't mention and that should be on here? If I get enough names, maybe I'll make a second video. If you guys haven't done so yet, make sure to smash that subscribe button and turn on those notifications if you're new to my channel. If you love college football, then this is definitely the place for you. Also, make sure to drop a like on this video as well. It helps share the video with more college football fans, plus it only takes a second to do. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.